Can we call Mr. Graham?
Mr. Graham, could you enter a
Hello,
phone
yes.
number?
Can you hear me? Is this
Yes,
working better?
Oh,
Yeah,
much better.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you. So sorry about that. How are you guys doing? My name is Anthony Graham, and Chair Bonds, committee members, and staff, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak. I'm a resident of the district and representing the DC Association of Realtors and our 3,000 members. The COVID-19 pandemic has clearly damaged our communities and economy. Many in our beloved District of Columbia are struggling with deep financial and personal loss. DCAR understands your awareness of how the rental housing community has been among the hardest hit. We recognize the city has taken steps to address the hardships, including the mayor's rental housing strike force. Thank you, Councilmember Bonds, Silverman, and Pinto for contributing towards solutions. Today, we are focusing on the Office of Tenant Advocacy mission to advocate for the rights and interests of district renters. We've heard accounts from our members who represent tenants that they agonize over whether the pandemic will force them into losing secure housing. On the other side, DC's small housing providers are grappled with anxiety. For example, one of our members, a longtime Washingtonian, reached out with profound concerns about losing the duplex that had been in her family for decades. She's not a professional landlord by any means, like most who work with 4 units or less. Unfortunately, if she is forced to sell, her longtime tenants will suffer as well, similar to many other smaller housing situations. DCAR understands that the city, including the council, have taken measures to protect vulnerable tenants during the pandemic, like the eviction moratorium. To be clear, we fully appreciate the moratorium keeping families housed to reduce community spread, as well as protecting those who have lost their livelihood due to COVID-19. However, achieving this goal has now brought about a very negative consequence. There are, unfortunately, a limited number of unlawful tenants who are posing a health and safety threat to their fellow residents. At DCAR, we learn of violent incidents from our members who own or manage small properties. Altercations where we've heard of a dangerous tenant pouring bleach on a resident, for example. Sadly, incidents of bodily harm are not few and far between, and regrettably, there is no remedy. Tenants and housing providers living in unsafe housing communities left without recourse, we don't believe is the intent. We are asking the committee to move forward on an amendment for a very specific health and safety exception to the eviction moratorium. We thank the committee members who've begun working on this, including the leadership of Chairperson Bonds. Furthermore, in uncertain situations like these, tenants must feel that they can turn to OTA to support evictions related to health and safety risks. We can definitively say that OTA and the council, especially the housing committee, do an excellent job at protecting tenants in this district. Unfortunately, the resources to help small housing providers comply with new sets of rules and regulations are very limited. It's crucial that this is addressed. When housing providers have access to resources, it translates into higher quality service for tenants. We believe more can be done to assist housing providers, such as additional ombudsman services and/or community outreach. We welcome hearing from government officials on ways our members can better serve the community and are happy to collaborate on these efforts to reach all housing providers, including longtime Washingtonians who only have 1 or 2 properties. We cannot stress enough, DCAR greatly appreciates you, Chair Bonds, and the Housing Committee for your continued leadership and for allowing us the opportunity to speak. The DC Association of Realtors is always willing to partner on housing issues affecting our city. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Graham, for your testimony. Thank you to the entire group of panelists this morning. I just have a very few questions. Mr. Marlin, I think it's appropriate to start with you, given your history, particularly as a member of the Rental Housing Commission. I think you said from 1981 to 85. Do I have the years correct?
Yes. Yes.
All right. And you said the intent then was to be a voice for tenants indirectly and for the landlords indirectly. Can you tell me a little bit about, give us some background on the intent of the original legislation, particularly as it dealt with rent stabilization and what we currently have in the way of rent control?
Um, well, it was quite a struggle back in the 70s when Marion Barry was the mayor to advance the interests of district renters. You remember that well because you were
Yes.
involved as well. And I was the deputy director of neighborhood legal services at that time. And we had a lot of landlord tenant cases. In fact, it was during that time that I was brought on to create a law reform unit to look at systemic problems in landlord tenant relations. And a lot of some far reaching court decisions came that have not only affected the district scene, but have nationally. But there was a recognition that the rents were, tenants were struggling with high rents, and so the council at that time, Hilda Mason was one of the leaders in enacting the program to put a floor on the rental structure, and it succeeded. I think it's been a very stabilizing, had a very stabilizing effect in this city. There are at least 45,000 persons covered under rent control now, and it's proven to be a highly worthwhile activity. I thought that last year's marathon hearings that you conducted, unfortunately, didn't result in any real progress. There were some, the Reclaim Rent Control Coalition, which produced dozens and dozens of witnesses before your committee, had some of their ideas, I thought, were a little bit exaggerated, but they also had some very sensible ideas that never reached a satisfactory conclusion. I would be glad if you requested to submit to you and to the committee my version of what should have been enacted and improvements in the rent control law that shouldn't offend anybody and should be accepted by the housing community, the housing provider community, as well as tenants. I think that some of the thoughts that were made about preventing rent increases above the cost of living really went too far, and were rejected by the Bowser administration, which the only thing that really resulted from last year's hearings was the moratorium on the voluntary agreements. And I trust that your committee is going to be doing something impactful about voluntary agreements. I know you've been working on it for a long time, but it probably needs a real resolution. Maybe the elimination of voluntary agreements is a good idea, unless it can be the the way that provision in the statute operates can be acceptable. I'm also concerned about I'm trying to think of the name for the other moratoria that you imposed affecting. Can you help me on this?
Definitely. You're speaking of the certificate of assurance,
Exactly.
which
Exactly.
I think began its life maybe in 1987, I believe, when I think it was a idea that included Carol.
I think it was Carol
Councilmember
Schwartz's.
Schwartz, yes. Yeah.
It was her idea, and it was a bad idea, and it's now preventing the expansion of rent control and the rent stabilization program to other units. And I think it should be repealed. And I submitted testimony to your committee about certificates of assurance. And it's a major stumbling block in improvement for renters in the city, for renters and for landlords. So you have a lot of work in the committee to accomplish.
Yes, we do. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Marlin. And I would be very interested in getting your ideas of your, total evaluation of those pieces of legislation and just generally a review of the rent control laws. So I look forward to getting that in writing. Thank you very much. Mr. Graham, can I just ask you, you indicated that you represent, that DCAR represents all of the, I guess, the properties, the rental properties in the city. Am I correct when you mentioned your 3,000 members?
They represent realtors.
Mr. Graham, are you still with us or? Okay, I'll come back to Mr. Graham. Mr. Hunt.
We have been joined by our one final public witness who was on the list to testify, Brian Lederer.
Well, okay, well, can I just finish with Mr. Hunter?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hunter, you indicated a couple of things that I wanted to ask about. Can you state for the record your absolute opinion of the eviction moratorium as it relates to, you mentioned there was some need for a carve out. Can you put on the record what you're speaking of?
Yes, council member, thank you very much. There were two things we made reference to. One, of course, is the public health and safety exemption, the emergency exemption. You've been working on that. You've received testimony from landlords as well as tenants asking for some relief as it relates to an emergency exemption, which they do in Maryland. And as you know, they allow evictions in Virginia. But the other exemption, the other carve out quickly, relates to rent control and rent concessions. The reality of the matter is that properties who are subject to rent control don't have the freedom to just, as you know, lower and raise their rent at will. The rent stabilization laws specifically provide when they can do it and how much they can do it. And the problem that we have right now is that, as you saw our survey, we saw vacancy rates of 15%, 20% in many small properties. And they can't compete against the larger modern properties as it relates to lowering their price. One of the reasons the vacancies aren't as high in the larger properties now because they have the flexibility to lower and raise their rent that these small providers do not. If they lower their rent, they'll be stuck at that new price, that new rent, and they will not be able to regain the previous rent that they had prior to the pandemic for many years. This would be a terrible disaster, as we're already, these small providers are hurting. The second thing, and I must speak to it, is the ability to raise the rent on a vacant unit. This makes no sense to prohibit raising the rent on a vacant unit. It's a vacant unit. If somebody wants to pay that rent, they should be able to. It really is harming landlords because, again, high vacancies, high delinquencies, inability to decrease the rent. You got one unit that someone's lived in for 10 years. Now they moved out. You want to raise the rent. Somebody wants to get it. You can't raise the rent. So those are the carve outs: public health and safety, the rent concession, the ability to up and lower the rent, and then again, the freedom to raise the rent on vacant units. Those are the things that are really critical.
All right, so if I'm hearing you correctly, one of the biggest issues that you're facing now is the inability to raise the rent on vacant units.
That's one. And the other is lower the rent on units that we can lower the units on. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you know, the whole rent control jargon is related to every unit that was in existence in 1975 and earlier, whether you were small or large or medium size. And so, you know, the rules are across the board. I hear what you're saying, and particularly given this health emergency, the fact that we are now going into, well, I think we're already into past 12 months of this. We're trying to look at the eviction law, trying to look at it with an understanding that no one expected it to last forever. And no one expected it to go on as many months that it has gone on. And so I believe through the strike force, there is some earnest effort to look at the types of carve outs we may need. But I think when we talk about the vacancy issue, I'm not getting the impression that we're there yet on that. So we'll need more information from you and perhaps even from Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, may I ask if that is an issue for DCAR as well?
Yes, ma'am. With regard to the vacancy?
Yes.
Issues? Yes, ma'am. We echo the same thing as Dean, that it is an issue specifically, in addition to the health and safety.
So are you, is your organization under the impression at this time that if a vacancy occurred because an individual had been in the property, previous tenant was in the property less than 10 years, that you can raise the rent to fill it by 10%? You understand that, right?
Correct.
During the moratorium.
Okay.
But I mean, the issues that with what, just like what Dean said, you can't do that in the moratorium. I think the issue obviously is that
I see.
The issue for us more so is that we're raising the rent so that way the small housing providers can make the adjustments to the property that they need to make to bring it up to code and things of that nature. There are other encumbrances that are happening as a result of in addition to the eviction moratorium not being able to raise the rents up.
Okay.
So both of them coupled together are encumbering small housing providers greatly.
I understand. The eviction moratorium, the stay of all activities really covers everything that we are doing currently, with the goal, of course, being to keep people housed during the pandemic. So
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much.
Yes, ma'am.
And Ram, you said we have an additional witness?
Yes, council member. Brian Lederer